started. We have a very full agenda for the day. We want to give everyone their due. So we're going to try and keep to our times. I'd like to welcome you all to the History Center. My name is Ann Mataros. I'm the director of the Curatorial Division and the chief historian here at the History Center. My more important role for today is as a partner and representative with the disability, the Western Pennsylvania Disability and Action History and Action Consortium. We just call them the consortium here, so not the full name. So we're so pleased that this event is taking place at the History Center. We've had the honor of working with the consortium for more than 4 years now, and our role has really been to document, preserve, and share the important history of disability advocacy here in the region with a much broader audience. So we have been working to build the collection. In the back of the room, you'll see some materials from our archives and from the museum collection, just a very small sample of the great materials that have come in to tell that story. For us to tell the story now and 50 years and 100 years in the future, we really need to be preserving the stories and the materials that capture that advocacy and that struggle for equal rights within the community, the disability community. So we thank those of you who've been working in partnership with us to ensure that we can preserve and tell that story, and we look forward to continuing to build that story. Today's event is done in partnership with the Western Pennsylvania Disability and Action Consortium, as I said, with Disability Rights PA, the Disability Voting Coalition of Pennsylvania, and of course is made possible by the Edith L. Trees Charitable Trust, our sponsor. We have assisted listening devices available in the lobby if anyone would like to use one, so please check there. And the only other thing I'd like to mention before I introduce our first speaker is on October 25th, we'll be doing another partnership program with the consortium, the University of Pittsburgh, and the National Bioethics Association with Rosemarie Garland Thompson, who will be here speaking on disability studies and on disability studies in the future. So pick up a flyer for that in the future, and we hope we'll see you that evening here at the History Center. Our first speaker today is Maria Town. We're very honored to have her today, distinguished President and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities. In this role, she works to increase the political and economic power of people with disabilities. She has a long history of working with government agencies as an advocate, both with the City of Houston, in the Obama White House, and more recently with the Department of Labor. Maria has many talents, some of them showcased online, where she's the creator of the popular CP Shoes blog, where she writes about fashion design and disability. She was recently named the Susan Daniels Disability Mentoring Hall of Fame and to the inaugural class of Emory University's 40 Under 40. Town hails from Louisiana, where her family still resides, and as I said, we are so thrilled to have her begin our day today. So please join me in welcoming Maria Town. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Thank you, Anne, for that really warm introduction. And thank you to all of the partners who have made today's event and today's conversation possible. I'm very honored to be here. As Anne mentioned, my name is Maria Town, and I serve as the President and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities, a cross-disability civil rights organization. This is my second time ever in Pittsburgh. My first time was 10 years ago, and I am looking forward to learning more from all of you about this great city and the vibrant disability community here. So despite the great introduction that I just received, I was given some guidance for this speech I was told to tell you some things that aren't in my bio when I introduce myself. And that prompt actually made me think about how we write bios in general, how we construct them. Our bios are typically a combination of two things. Things that we think are important about ourselves, and things that we think other people will think are important about us. Things that we think will make us seem important to others. And if it weren't for that second part, in my bio I would probably wax poetic about my love of queso, red lipstick, and my cats. My love for those things is very, very deep. But in response to the prompt, when you introduce yourself, tell us something that we wouldn't learn from your bio, I decided to rewrite my bio altogether in a way that was most relevant to today's event. So here we go, a brand new bio for Maria Town. I don't normally talk about myself in the third person, but for this exercise I will. Maria Town is a proud disabled woman, and like 14.5 million other Americans with disabilities, Maria votes at every chance she gets. She has been a voter in federal, state, and local elections in 2 states and the District of Columbia. Her most recent experiences with voting in the state of Texas include significant instances of discrimination on the basis of disability and disenfranchisement through strict voter ID laws. Upon trying to register to vote in Texas, her application was denied 3 times. When attempting to vote for the first time in the Lone Star State, she was initially denied the opportunity because although she was on the official list of registered voters and had a valid ID, she did not have a Texas ID. That's a whole nother story for a whole nother bio. And she had to advocate herself right then and there in the polling place. Following this experience, she remained undeterred and attempted to vote in the next election. When noting that the accessible voting machine wasn't working, she was told by a poll worker, "It's a short ballot. Stand up. You'll be fine." In her last experience voting, Maria was asked to provide an electricity bill to prove her Texas residency and had to leave the polling place to return the next day with further proof of residency, despite again showing a City of Houston badge, a valid ID, and active registration on the voter roll. Finally, shortly before leaving Texas, Maria received a letter from the county voter registrar stating that her voter registration was not valid. Upon investigation, Maria found out that her voter registration was indeed valid. She hopes that her experiences voting in the District of Columbia, her new home, go more smoothly and can work with the disability community across the country to improve voter access and increase voter turnout for disabled people all over the United States. My new bio. Now, I go through my voter bio to provide a small example of the barriers that people with disabilities face when attempting to perform their civic duty. And I want to make something clear, something that I hope is clear to all of you right now. I have immense privilege in these situations. The polling place that I was going to was in my office building. I didn't have to coordinate transit. I didn't have to request time off or risk my employment to vote. I didn't have to coordinate family care. I'm literate. English is my first language. I'm a motivated voter, I'm an informed voter, and I know my rights. At the time, it was my job to support disabled Houstonians navigating bureaucracy of local government, and even for me, I had to fight to vote. So when I think about the host of barriers faced by immigrants with disabilities, transit-dependent people with disabilities, disabled people of color, our brothers and sisters and institutions, I get mad. I also become unsurprised at the persistent turnout gap amongst voters with disabilities. 2% fewer people with disabilities register to vote than people without disabilities, and this contributes to a 5% turnout gap between people with disabilities and people without disabilities. I know 5% seems like a small number, but what 5% means in the context of national voting rates is 2.3 eligible people with disabilities 2.3 million, that's important, eligible people with disabilities not casting their ballots on election day. The most commonly expressed reason for not registering to vote among people with and without disabilities was a lack of interest in election or politics, voter apathy. You hear about this a lot. About 1/4 of people with disabilities, 25%, gave permanent illness or disability as their reason for not being registered. Among disabled people who were registered to vote but did not do so in the 2018 midterm elections, about 40% of people with disabilities gave illness or disability as the reason for not voting. Now, I don't want to diminish real experiences where an illness or disability may in fact prevent someone from voting. However, these statistics don't paint the full picture. As disability rights advocates, we know so often that our disability is not the actual issue. It's barriers that surround us and prevent us from engaging in civic life. It's the fatigue that's created not from an illness or a condition, but fatigue from fighting constant microaggressions and discrimination. Thankfully, we have other data that actually shows this. The Government Accountability Office, GAO, observed polling place accessibility in about 178 polling places in the 2016 election, and they found the following results. Of the 178 polling places, 60%, 107 of them, had one or more impediments. Of the 137, where the GAO was able to look at the full voting process inside the polling place, 65% had a voting station with an accessible system that could actually impede someone from casting a private independent ballot. So even our accessible polling places can leave a lot to be desired. And when thinking about all this, it's when I remember that disenfranchisement is easy to do. It shouldn't be, but it is. Apathy is easy to maintain. Voting is hard to do. It shouldn't be, but it is. Hope is hard to maintain. Movements are harder to build and even harder to maintain. But to quote President Kennedy, who knows what quote is coming? Exactly. We do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one that we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. We need to build hope and motivation in order to grow our movement so that the power of the disability community will be felt coast to coast. And thankfully, we have many opportunities to do this. Here in Allegheny County, you all have an election coming up on November 5th, I believe, right? Yes. How many of you are planning to vote? I should see like every head shaking yes, awesome. It's the general election that shapes the government of your cities, your county, and your judges' chambers for years to come. In Allegheny County, you have a referendum on the district attorney and the county executive, two of the region's most powerful politicians. In Pittsburgh, you're electing a new crop of city council members, and statewide, there are 2 seats up for the Superior Court. These are the people, the officials, that will execute the policies and programs that shape the lives of people with disabilities. And that's why voting at every opportunity is so important. There's so much at stake in every election. Want to make sure that people with disabilities are treated fairly in your local justice system. Elect a DA and judges who understand that people with disabilities are overrepresented in the criminal justice system itself. Want to get more funding for improved sidewalk accessibility. Elect city council members who understand transit equity. Want to make sure that people with disabilities aren't left behind in emergencies and disasters. Elect a county executive who understands that disability-related needs are not special, they are human. And while we're on the subject of the ways that civic engagement directly impacts our lives, I have to mention the census. In addition to a major election in 2020, we will also have the census. So the father of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Justin Dart, and this quote is on this side to my left, your right, said, "Vote as if your life depends on it because it does." And I'll say, get counted in the census as if your life depends on it because it does. The census is much more than a head count. The outcomes of the census determine how many congressional representatives you have. They determine how and where federal and state dollars will be distributed. So if you are a person with a disability who receives Medicaid or SNAP, your participation in the census will help determine whether or not you continue to receive those funds and supports. Literally, your life depends on it. Get counted. Now, getting back to voting directly, all of you in this room are already the experts of what's happening here in Pennsylvania, but let's go ahead and talk about the upcoming election in November and who can register to vote and how they can vote. So this is great. In Pennsylvania, you can register online. That's not available in every state. In fact, far too few. You can register to vote if you are homeless. Also wonderful. You can register to vote if you do not have an ID number or a social security number, and you're not required to disclose disability assistance needs or language. You can't vote anywhere, however. You have to vote in a specific polling place, and one of the strategies that's been shown to drastically increase voter turnout across populations is county-wide voting centers that have flexible hours. You can vote if you have been convicted of a felony and have been released from prison, or are still on parole or living in a halfway house. You can also vote if you have not been convicted of a felony but are located in a penal facility. Again, this isn't true across all states, so it's wonderful that Pennsylvania is doing this. You can also vote if you've been convicted of a misdemeanor, no matter where you're located, and if you are submitting an application late, the deadline for this election was October 5th, I believe, your application will still be relevant for future elections. Now, I got online, and I tried to use the Secretary of State's tool to locate accessible polling places throughout Pittsburgh. And in doing so, I reviewed the criteria for what it takes to get that access symbol located next to your location. And though the criteria were very strong and comprehensive on physical accessibility, they asked about accessible parking spaces, barrier-free paths, the availability of elevators, among many other things. There were no criteria related to the availability of accessible bathrooms. So let's hope you don't have to go when you go vote. There were also no criteria that reflected any other form of accessibility, like plain language signs at a polling place for people with cognitive disabilities, or scent-free facilities for people with chemical sensitivities. Perhaps, most surprisingly, within the criteria for an accessible polling place, there was no requirement that there be a working, accessible voting machine at the site. So advocates, y'all have some work to do. I also tried to figure out exactly how many voting machines were used across Pennsylvania's 67 counties. And there were so many, it was hard for me to keep track, which presents a whole other set of issues. Different machines operate different ways. The accessibility features may not be widely known across the community. So folks need to demand demonstrations from the Secretary of State's office or the county clerk's office to make sure everyone understands how to operate accessible machines. One of the other things I found when on the website was the prevalence in mentions of the absentee ballots for voters with disabilities. Absentee ballots are incredibly important for people who may not be able to get to the polls. However, they should not be the primary strategy when thinking about voters with disabilities. Voters with disabilities need to have the expectation that we can just show up, because we will, right? I understand the Secretary of State is working on the timeliness of counting absentee ballots. The deadline to request an absentee ballot for the upcoming election is October 29th. But again, we should be working across voter access for all of these elements. Absentee ballots are just one strategy. So when we think about the strategies that will help us bridge that gap in turnout and registration for people with disabilities, I want all of you to know that disability advocates have a lot to teach this state. And when we are looking at disenfranchisement and how to attack it, we have to do so in an intersectional way. One of my favorite disability rights advocates is Fannie Lou Hamer. For folks that may not know, Fannie Lou Hamer had polio. And when she was being brutalized by police while trying to make sure that Black people in the South could vote, she would protect the side of her body that had been impacted by polio so that she could keep functioning in her society. One of my favorite quotes from her is, "Nobody's free till everybody's free." And unfortunately, so many communities are fighting disenfranchisement across this country and within this state. And if we go together with other communities, we are stronger. This is a powerful, powerful room, but imagine how powerful we could be if we reached out to others. Is there an immigrant church in your neighborhood? Reach out. See how they're dealing with language access at the polls. Is there an LGBT center near your place of work? Reach out. See if people understand what's at stake on the ballot. Is there a nursing home in your neighborhood? Help get people to the polls. Pennsylvania has a growing population of refugees. We talk about trauma-informed care, trauma-informed workplace. Let's imagine trauma-informed voting. What does that look like, and how do we recognize PTSD at the polls? In order to attack disenfranchisement, we need to have an inclusive dialogue across partners built on mutual respect. I used to work for a municipal government and would have to work with a county to determine accessible polling sites. I worked in the city of Houston. What happens very frequently in Houston? Flooding. So, an accessible polling site that was chosen 3 months before might get flooded the week of the election and no longer be available, right? Oftentimes you'll find that churches are accessible voting sites. Religious institutions do not have to comply with the ADA. But in attempting to move a polling site from a church, potentially a trusted site amongst a marginalized community, you actually reduce access in another kind of way. I'd like to tell you all a story about an advocate based in Philadelphia named Anna Pern. Anna is an Asian American woman, an amazing disability advocate, who hosts a disability support group for members of her church, who are also Asian Americans. Her church is also a polling place. In hosting this support group, Anna showed her church that there was a community of people with disabilities within their flock. And in doing so, they created a larger investment in accessibility so that that polling place became accessible. This is one example of something that we could all be doing as individuals and as organizations. Cultural competency is a key part of voter access, whether it's disability cultural competency, competency around racial bias and gender and sexual orientation. And voting should be the best thing that someone does. It is a huge part of what makes us a democracy, what makes us an American, and we need to stop traumatizing people with disabilities, particularly marginalized people with disabilities, with bad experiences. So even though your state and your county have a primary responsibility for voter access, at the local level you can do a lot. Look at the training for poll workers. Make sure they understand how to navigate language access needs. For these reasons and for so many more, AAPD started the Rev Up program. Rev Up stands for Register, Educate, Vote, Use Your Power. Pennsylvania is not a Rev Up state, but that's part of the reason I'm so glad to be here. The Rev Up campaign aims to increase the political participation of the disability community while also engaging candidates and the media on disability issues. AAPD has 32 Rev Up state coalitions and works with state and national leaders on effective nonpartisan campaigns to address the concerns of people with disabilities, eliminate barriers to voting, promote accessibility, and educate communities about disability issues. I want to end on a high note. We came out with a recent study through Rutgers that showed that voter turnout in the 2018 election surged by 18.5 points among citizens with disabilities relative to the 2014 midterm elections. The increase in turnout between 2014 and 2018 among people with disabilities was up 9% in Rev Up states compared to 5.7% in non-Rev Up states. And based on the Census Bureau data, turnout was increased by 257,000 voters with disabilities in Rev Up states in 2018, with a total of 14.5 million citizens with disabilities voting in the midterm elections. In Texas, I know I've talked a lot about Texas, one of our most active Rev Up states, there were close to 900,000 registered voters with a disability license plate or parking placard. And in the 2016 election, 73% of them voted compared to 62.5% of all voters. That's amazing. Thank you. Nationwide, if people with disabilities voted at the same rate as people without disabilities who have the same demographic characteristics, there would be about 2.4 million more voters with disabilities than who actually voted in 2018. Among the 108 million voters without disabilities, 10 million of them lived in a household with someone with a disability. And so if you combine those numbers, there were approximately 25 million voters in disability households, 25 million people who had a vested interest in disability issues. That equals 20% of our whole voting body. We have such significant power in this community, and I have one more bit of good news. October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month, and I'm sure most of you in this room who are working on voting are also working on employment. And I want to say thank you, because our research showed that employed people with disabilities were just as likely to vote as employed people without disabilities. So employment is also a gateway to mainstream civic engagement. So as you all go on with your work, as we go on today, I want you to think about reaching out to AAPD, finding out how we can support you in your efforts, but also think about reaching out to partners you may not have considered in the past, working with your office of your Secretary of State and your county clerk to address more than physical accessibility and making sure that people with disabilities understand that their vote matters. In 2020, I want the nation to not only feel our power in our votes on election day, but as we get counted in the census. People with, again, vote as if your life depends on it, because it does. Get counted as if your life depends on it, because it does. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many friends and family and advocates, lots of familiar faces. My name is Paul Friend, and my role today is to introduce Rachel Friend. We were life partners and husband and wife for 20 years. She passed away from cancer 6 years ago in the prime of life, and in the middle of organizing a grassroots political movement with people with disabilities. They called themselves Let Our Voices Be Heard. They organized people in personal care boarding homes to raise the personal needs allowance, and they helped large numbers of people with disabilities register to vote. One of Rachel's favorite quotations was from John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie. We find after years of struggle that we do not take a trip. A trip takes us. Rachel and I took many trips together, or should I say, many trips took us on memorable adventures, without drugs, I might say. She loved to plan our next trip and always seeking my input and opinions. Rachel worked this way with Let Our Voices Be Heard. Together they planned trips to housing meetings, voter access rallies, and legislative visits locally and in Harrisburg. These trips took participants on civic adventures where many experienced their collective power as a grassroots movement and their individual power as active citizens. When Rachel passed away 6 years ago, I experienced an outpouring of gratitude from hundreds of people who were enlivened by her spirit. I'll read a few of the very poignant messages sent to me in the wake of her passing. Paul, somewhere deep within our hearts is a place where we connect with all that is divine and eternal. Rachel possessed kindness that welcomed people across differences and abilities to meet in that deeper place. I speak for many advocates whose voices were empowered by Rachel's work, and today have no words to express the sorrow in our hearts at her passing. Dear Paul, I just want you to know that Rachel's life is a testament to all that is good in this world. Her spirit will be celebrated and always live on through the actions of the many that she has inspired to soar beyond what they thought was possible. And finally, a card from a group of a dozen individuals, I think from a drop-in center or Center for Independent Living. We want to extend our prayers to Rachel's family and friends, but most of all, we want to thank Rachel for being there for us, for sharing her knowledge, for helping us to understand our place in the community and the role we play, for being our friend, but most of all, for helping us see we have a voice in the world that can be heard, and that is the greatest gift you can give to anyone. Thank you, Rachel. We love you. Rachel teamed up with Paul O'Hanlon in 2003, and they worked together until Rachel passed on 6 years ago. Paul will take it from here and present highlights of their approach and accomplishments. Thank you.
Paul, we'd ask you to wait a moment here. In July of this year, Paul generously donated an array of historic records, photographs, and artifacts that speak to Rachel's advocacy. And we really wanted to take this opportunity to honor you and honor her. We of the Senator John Heinz History Center and the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium are honored to preserve and share the story of your wife, Rachel. We sincerely thank you, Paul, for your generosity in donating historic materials that illuminate Rachel's tireless work, encouraging, educating, and empowering people with disabilities and people within the mental health community to exercise their right to vote. Please accept this gift as a thank you on behalf of the History Center and the consortium. Future researchers spending time with Rachel's collection will undoubtedly benefit from her enduring example of grassroots voting advocacy. Thank you.
I need to get this clicker working so I know what I can depend on. Okay, great. So my name is Paul O'Hanlon, and probably what I should start off by saying that my mission is to sort of explain how the Disability Voting Coalition was created, and that there are probably a cast of hundreds, if not thousands, who were involved in this, and that the only thing I could probably say that's true is that nobody had a bigger role than Rachel and I. And so to tell the story of the Disability Voting Coalition, I have to tell the story of Rachel and I working together, and so that's kind of what you're going to hear. This is a picture of Rachel delivering a petition signed by hundreds of people who were residents of personal care homes in Harrisburg. And when Rachel and I met, we were both relatively new at our jobs. Rachel worked for the Mental Health Association of Allegheny County. I worked for what was then called the Disabilities Law Project. I had been a housing lawyer for about 20 years, specializing in low-income housing issues. And when I started working for Disabilities Law Project, I was presented with an opportunity to go into the area of voting law. We had just gotten a grant through the Help America Vote Act, and the mission of that grant was to ensure the full participation of people with disabilities in the electoral process. And so the question was, did I want to do that instead of housing? And I thought, the full participation of people with disabilities in the electoral process, that sounds kind of exciting. So I said, okay, sure. Rachel was doing organizing in the mental health area, and we met at a housing conference, and we started talking about how we could work together, me with my interest in election law, and Rachel and her interest in organizing people with mental health conditions. And as Paul explained, really this is a conversation of really about 10 years of work. And this is a picture of Rachel at the beach where she had written into the sand, "Love Life." And it really was both sort of what Rachel represented and really, I think, her message to all of us. One of the things about Rachel is that Rachel self-identified as being a person with a mental health history, and it didn't always come out, but one of the ways it would come out is that Rachel didn't like to leave things to the last minute. And so she would always say to me, I don't want to leave things to the last minute. So we would be planning, for example, a legislative breakfast that we were planning maybe 2.5 months in the future. And I would then, leave that, we would plan this thing, and then 2 days later I would see her and she would say, okay, I have the room, I have the guests confirmed, I have, and I have all the food arranged, and the thing about Rachel is that it was sort of, she had superhuman abilities to organize things and make things happen. And so it was just one of the amazing things working with her. This is a quote from something that Rachel wrote. Voting does more than elect politicians. Through the act of voting, people become dynamic players in the political arena where policy decisions are made, and both their political and personal power grows. They become active citizens connected with the community of voters. And the thing that you need to understand also about Rachel's approach to kind of political organizing is that it really fit within the mental health recovery movement. And so much of what Rachel was about was organizing people with disabilities to really make progress in their recovery. And recovery for people with disabilities can include sort of recovering their place in life. And so I think that, one of the things that you're going to see in this is really her ongoing efforts to really empower people and enable them to recover their lives. Meanwhile, what I bring to the table is sort of a different attitude. One of my heroes in the area of election law is Willie Sutton. Willie Sutton, you may not realize, had nothing to do with elections or voting. He was a bank robber. And Willie Sutton's magic was to basically say, I rob banks because that's where the money is. So, my approach was, if I'm here to include the full participation of people with disabilities in the electoral process, there's something you need to know. People with disabilities are the largest minority group in America. You don't disenfranchise, you don't marginalize the largest minority group in American politics without excluding huge numbers of people along the way. So I wanted to know, where were the people with disabilities that were being excluded? And Rachel introduced me to the world of personal care homes. Now, I don't know how many people here know what a personal care home is. It's not a nursing home. It's a lot like a nursing home, but it's different. And so here's what you need to know about personal care homes. There are about 51,000 people in Pennsylvania that lived in personal care homes at this point in time, and about now it's about the same. Allegheny County had the largest number of personal care homes and had the largest number of people living in personal care homes in all of Pennsylvania. And statewide, about almost 10,000 of those people had SSI as their source of income. And one of the things about a personal care home is that it's essentially, if you need skilled nursing, you're probably going to be in a nursing home. If you don't need skilled nursing, but you need help with activities of daily living, like feeding or dressing or preparing food or remembering to take your medication, there's a variety of things that cause people to land in a personal care home. And lots of people with mental illness land in personal care homes as a point after hospitalization. So, for example, they may be hospitalized, and the next step is to have them go into personal care home. And you can get stuck there, we discovered. And so what Rachel was explaining to me was that as an organizer in the mental health area, what she was concerned was that people got stuck in a personal care home. And the way that it happened is that when you live in a personal care home, if, for example, your income is SSI, all of your money every month goes to the personal care home except for a whopping $60 a month. And that $60 a month is what you use to buy your clothing, your toiletries, your medical copay, transportation. It doesn't go far. Now, after you splurge with your $60 a month, how long will it take you to save up the first month's rent and security deposit when you're ready to move? And the answer is probably forever. And so we started to look at how could we support people with disabilities to be able to transition out of personal care homes. And so that became our first kind of focus, because we knew that in order to build a political movement, you have to both focus on the mechanics of organizing and registering people to vote, but you also had to give them a reason to vote, something to get interested and excited about. And so we looked at how do we build campaigns around issues that people with disabilities would be interested and excited about. And so essentially what we started urging the state to do was people who have SSI as their source of income, living in a personal care home, get an extra state supplement. And that was hundreds of dollars a month that the state paid for them to be able to stay in a personal care home. And essentially our argument was, okay, then if that supplement could be made portable, if a person could move out of that personal care home, taking that state supplement, using it for either a rent supplement or to pay for supports to come into the home, that it would enable people to transition out of personal care homes. And so that really became our first campaign. Meanwhile, as we were the idea was we would develop these campaigns and we would use the Letter of Voices Be Heard group that we were organizing and building to be our kind of organizing group. And Letter of Voices Be Heard was sort of designed to be a cross-disability group, including both people with all disabilities. One of our members then presented us with an opportunity around Election Day because she was assigned to an inaccessible polling place, and at that point there was really no recourse for her because her deadline to have requested either an absentee ballot or what's known as an alternative ballot was a week before Election Day. So by the time Election Day ran around, she had no recourse, and we organized a demonstration and was surprised when the poll workers brought out a ballot for her to vote and basically allowed her to vote on the sidewalk. Now, Pennsylvania does not allow curbside voting, and one of the things we were urging was that Pennsylvania should allow curbside voting, certainly at polling places that were inaccessible. And so that was kind of what we were hoping to force. And we got that result, although as the election director says in this article, it was a mistake that they shouldn't have given her that option of voting with a ballot at the curbside because state law doesn't allow it. As a result of this action, we actually got the state to implement a new procedure, and they created what's now known as an emergency alternative ballot that you can request as late as Election Day. But the problem was, we were glad that they came up with some solution, but what you'll notice is that the solution that they created was if you go to vote on Election Day and can't get into your polling place because it's not accessible, what you need to do now is get yourself down to the county election office and apply for an emergency absentee ballot, alternative ballot, which means that they've translated an accessibility problem to a transportation problem. And that for people who live in rural counties where there isn't any public transportation to speak of, certainly not one that you can get on that same day, it made essentially it was no help. And so when that was the state policy that was created, we realized that we really need to start operating at the state level, that really just being limited to Allegheny County wasn't going to really give us the power to confront these state decisions, that we needed a larger kind of approach. And so that was when we decided to start organizing for what became the Disability Voting Coalition. And in 2005, November, was our kind of kickoff meeting in Harrisburg. And we did get press for that event, which was great. The Patriot News wrote an article. I was quoted as saying, too many service providers confuse being nonpartisan with being non-political. And that was really a reflection of a growing frustration that we were feeling around the whole issue of voter registration and disability agencies. So, meanwhile, we had a bit of a victory on our campaign about the making the personal, the SSI supplement portable. The state agreed to pilot that idea of ours, but unfortunately it was sort of, the way that the pilot was done sort of guaranteed its non-success. What we realized was that if we could make a supplement portable and enable people to move out of a personal care home, it was really the people who were most able, most at the point where they could move out, you know, sort of like, you know, it was sometimes known as creaming, you know, getting the people at the very top and enabling them to move out. But the problem was, that's not what the state did. The state basically said, we're gonna make it available to homes that are under closure orders, where the residents would have to make a decision within 30 days and do it all on their own. And we said, you know, there's never going to be anybody in a crisis situation that's going to elect to do that. And we were right. It was a pilot that essentially failed. So out of that, we sort of recouped, because there were a number of things that we found frustrating with that campaign. And one of which was, of course, the way that the pilot was run. But the other one was that it was a campaign that lacked a good constituency. That, you know, most of the, if 10% of the, you know, personal care home residents might conceivably be ready to move out, that meant that 90% weren't. And a lot of people felt that it was a campaign that didn't really matter to them. They weren't looking to move out. And, you know, and so I think it was a good campaign from a policy standpoint, but it wasn't a good campaign from an organizing standpoint. And the other thing was that, you know, it didn't allow people to tell a story that had them feeling good about themselves. And so seeing that, we sort of realized that we needed to change our approach. And so what we did instead was that we listened to what the people were talking about when we were talking about this idea we had of a pilot that, you know, of making the supplement portable. What they talked about was, you know, we only have $60 a month. It'd be great if we could get that increased. And so we started to focus on that, this thing that was known as a personal needs allowance, this $60, hadn't been increased for over 15 years. And so we started a campaign to increase that. And this was a picture of a Harrisburg action that was really around bringing attention to that. So this is just some of the kind of literature that we were putting out. This is David C. David served our country in the U.S. Marine Corps during the Vietnam War, and as a police officer for 7 years, a series of serious health problems landed David, who was 56, in a personal care home. Each month after paying his room and board, David received $60 to spend, and it's sort of like the budget of what he spends on $10 clothing, a shop at St. Vincent de Paul, et cetera, et cetera. David's message was, Governor Rendell, if I get a raise in my monthly allowance, I'd live a more productive life. I could go back to school, I could go to outings with the drop-in center, I'd be able to socialize more. Shirley's message, there's no way you can live on $60. My husband's birthday is 6 months from now. I want to give him a gift, and I'll have to struggle to save for his birthday present. Bob's message. The price of everything is increasing. 60 is not enough to live on. I served this country in Vietnam and I voted for you, Governor Rendell. At least scratch my back a little. And I think that what we saw was that this was a campaign that people could just be regular people wanting to do the things that everybody wanted to do. And it was really a much more successful campaign. January 2nd of 2009, we were successful. I think that we got what amounts to about a 40% increase, which sounds really great, but it was only about $25, but it still mattered, and it was a successful campaign. Meanwhile, as we were having these sort of issues campaigns, we were working on the doing of organizing, of getting people registered to vote, doing vote registration trainings, and we were really frustrated at the beginning, around 2003, 2004. Of course, it was a presidential year, 2004. As we all know, every 4 years we get kind of hyper crazy about politics and elections, and so 2003, 2004, we were looking at the upcoming presidential election, and so we decided to do a series of trainings directed toward disability agencies and developed this guide for agencies that serve people with disabilities. And we were frustrated because the truth is they didn't come. And what we were seeing was that the law, the National Voter Registration Act, says each state shall designate as voter registration agencies all offices in the state that provide state-funded programs primarily engaged in providing services to persons with disabilities. So, and that means that if the state's funding a program, whether it's homemaker services, Meals on Wheels, personal care homes, nursing homes, these are all agencies that are supposed to be registering people to vote. And so when the agencies weren't coming to us, weren't attending our trainings, we decided to go to them. And what Rachel essentially organized was people who were part of this Let Our Voices Be Heard and the Disability Voting Coalition to start going out to agencies and staffing tables and doing registrations. But as we were doing that, we were sort of noticing that, again, it was more like things weren't happening. And we didn't have any data to really prove our experience that things weren't happening, but it seemed that things weren't happening. The other thing, around 2008, we piloted a program that has continued to this day called Ballots for Patients. And the idea was that on election day, hospitals are full of people who weren't planning to be there probably, and that they don't have a way to vote unless we bring the election to them. And so we started doing ballots for patients. Then, around 2007, we discovered that the state actually kept records on this thing called voter registration by disability agency. And we were surprised that they kept records because we didn't know how they would even know. So you may be surprised that this is a report that gets issued every year to the General Assembly explaining what kind of voter registrations were going on. And because, and that's when we started this campaign called WeCount. WeCount was about organizing individuals with disabilities to register to vote, and you know, a recount puts the state on notice that we're tracking these numbers. When we realized that the state was actually keeping records, we started to bring attention to what those records show and recounts a statement to the political parties that people with disabilities make up a sizable portion of eligible voters. This was sort of our reach. Rachel was an amazing organizer, but you know, everybody has their limits. So we had really a reach to about a 6-county area, and so here's some data. Our 6 counties have about 16, almost 17% of the state population. And what we were surprised to see was that what the state data showed was that our disability registrations were only about half of that, about 8.1% of the state. And so, you know, this is 2006 numbers, which we find out the next year. So in other words, we didn't know what 2006 numbers were till after July of 2007. So this was June, you know, after July 2007, and we saw that the numbers were really pretty bad. And we thought, okay, we can make those numbers go up. So this would be 2007, and this was before we really started. So basically these two years, 2006, 2007, was before we got involved. 2008 is a presidential election year. We were very active, and we were hoping that our results would show up on the state records. So here's what it was. So the following year, we basically accounted for over half of the state's registrations. And 2009, we also accounted for over half. Basically in 2008, so 2007, Allegheny County had 0 registrations by disability agencies. By 2008, we led the state, and we've led the state every year since then. So here's 2010. 2011 is the point where Rachel was getting sick, and we were really curtailing some of the organizing that she was doing as a result. But 2011 numbers, in other words, this is 2012 now, where we're looking at 2011 numbers. 2012 was really a decision both because of Rachel's declining health and kind of a growing frustration on our part that, I mean, the reality is Pennsylvania is a state of 12 million people. If 2 of us can have an impact where we account for over 50% of the state's registration, there's a serious problem there. I mean, like, the 2 greatest people in the universe should not be able to account for 50% of the whole state's registration. And so what the numbers, although our numbers were high, it really showed that there wasn't anything else happening beyond kind of like what we were doing. And it raised the question of whether, kind of what direction to go. A lot of the allies that we were working with decided that they wanted to sue the state because they weren't seeing numbers that really accounted for it. So I wanted to just sort of show you, so our kind of peers were the county assistance offices. And we were looking at, okay, how do our registration compare with their registrations? And you see that, you know, it's sort of like we were about 1/4 to 1/5 of their numbers. And all the numbers are pretty crappy, you know, but basically, like, just as an example, in 2010, the county assistance office did about 3,000 registrations, and we did 431. Back in 2008, when we had over 50% of registration, you know, the state disability agency registration were only 733, so it's not like we're dealing with giant numbers. So there was a lawsuit that was brought, BPEP and some local groups in Allegheny County were the plaintiffs, and unfortunately the disability community, despite my best efforts, did not join in that lawsuit, did not bring the disability agency's issue into that lawsuit. So the question is, well, did that lawsuit make a difference? What you're going to see is that basically, beginning in 2011, where before the lawsuit, there were 5,000 registrations by county assistance offices. The next year, there were 10,000. The year after that, there were 47,000. The year after that, there were 66,000. So it was obvious that the lawsuit made a difference, but since we weren't part of it, we were left behind. The last thing that we really turned to was civic engagement trainings to work, really allow for kind of remote participation. We're looking at how Rachel could be involved in video conferencing and things like that. And I think that what's really kind of dramatic was to sort of see the evolution of our expectation of our members. You know, in the very beginning, we trained people to have the role of what we call voter educators. And they were people who knew how to kind of answer questions and how people register. Soon what we discovered was that people were ready for more than that. And we started this program called ambassadors. And ambassadors would be people who would go to an agency, set up, plan to staff a table, organize that table, et cetera, and then finally, in our last kind of things, we were developing what we were calling citizen leaders. And so I want to end with kind of two things. One is a quote from one of our members, Let Our Voices Be Heard. His name was Ralph. And I think that it really represents everything that kind of Rachel was shooting for. Ralph says, I feel that I'm here. I should say that this was after a trip to Harrisburg. What Rachel would do is every time there would be a trip to Harrisburg, the ride back, she would sort of be going to everybody in the bus, writing in her little notebook that she always carried everything that people would say to her about being on that trip. And so this is what Ralph said. I feel that I'm here representing a lot of people. I can go back home and share the information with others who aren't as involved as I am. Being involved in this group, being respected by others, has helped me to have respect for myself. If you have a sense of self-respect, you can go anywhere with it. I feel like I want to belong and to bring the message back. When they applauded for us on the Senate floor, I was deeply moved. People of worth could see us. They were applauded because of being recognized for being part of the success of getting the personal needs allowance increase. And this was a quote that Rachel liked to use a lot, that meant a lot to her. People who have ideas and drive are on every street and every walk of life, waiting in the wings, ready to be discovered. Someone has to reach them and recognize them. Someone has to ask them to step out, not to be consumers or props or spectators, but to be players in the unfolding drama of public life. So if anybody here was part of Let Our Voices Be Heard or worked with Rachel, if you could sort of stand or something, I just want to kind of honor people who are involved and share that. So thank you. Thank you.
Paul, do you want to stay up here? Paul? Paul, you're on the next panel, so you can stay up here.
Okay.
You can have the panel come up.
folks on the next panel to come up? So we have Ron Magnus, Paul Hammond, Christine Hunsinger, Nick Sinagra, and Matthew Taylor. This is where your theater training comes in handy, right?
Good afternoon. I'm Ron Bandes, moderator of this panel on barriers to accessibility and solutions. And I'm greatly honored to be here, and I'm honored to be representing the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh. Although I did work on a project for the National Federation of the Blind to help design a remote ballot marking device, my expertise is in election security, or more broadly, election integrity. After the debacle of the 2000 presidential election, especially in Florida, the country almost entirely replaced their various voting systems. At that time, many people felt that accessibility and election security were opposing goals. Some still do, but people representing each of these interests have learned to respect and incorporate the goals of the other interest. Allegheny County just made their selection of a new voting system to be used in the 2020 primary election for the first time. I was the point person for two important organizations that fought hard for good election integrity for all people in that selection. Vote Allegheny and the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh. I was so proud of numerous people that spoke up at Board of Election meetings, spoke up at county council meetings, observed demonstrations of voting machines, and gained more knowledge than they had known they were missing. Even after, maybe even especially after, it looked like we had won the right for hand-marked paper ballots for the majority of voters, because this provides the best election integrity, we continued to fight hard for a machine that would provide the best ballot secrecy and the best voter verifiability for people who cannot hand-mark a paper ballot. We want all voters to have the opportunity to vote independently, with privacy, ballot secrecy, and with the assurance that their votes will be counted as intended and as easily as the other goals allow. Because Allegheny County turns out to have capacity requirements for the number of candidates, 10,000 candidates sometimes in this county in one election, and the number of contests, 4,000 contests possible in a single election in this county. Few other jurisdictions in the whole country have such intense requirements. And for that reason, and because of missteps in the selection process, the county chose a system that produces a ballot that can only be considered voter verifiable if the county does a much, much better job of election audits than they have done in the past. It just so happens that the Commonwealth settled a lawsuit with the Jill Stein campaign to do just that. Vote Allegheny, the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh, and the Black Political Empowerment Project will all be fighting to make sure that the county doesn't just have the appearance of better audits, but that they make it a reality. This panel will be discussing barriers to accessibility and solutions. Our panelists have strong backgrounds and terrific stories. Please see their biographies available at the table. Also, Braille and large print editions can be found at the check-in desk. Panelist Christine Hunsinger is president of Golden Triangle Council of the Blind and second vice president of Pennsylvania Council of the Blind. Christina and I were representatives of Western Pennsylvania on the Joint State Government Commission's Committee on Modernizing Voting Technology to advise the Pennsylvania General Assembly, she specializing in the needs of voters with disabilities. I, of course, was more representing the interests of election security. Today, Christine will focus on barriers to voting for the visually impaired. We know that many people, don't vote for a variety of reasons, some good and some bad. Christine pointed out to me that voters with disabilities can have all those reasons, plus the difficulties of overcoming the barriers that she will describe. Nick Sinagra is Director of Technology at PathView. Today, Nick will tell us about groundbreaking work on the universal voting booth, although it is much more than just a booth, as you will soon hear. You can see the universal voting booth at the Carnegie Museum of Art. Paul O'Hanlon, who we just heard from, is an attorney with a long history of good works in disability rights, as well as other issues such as poverty, housing, transportation, and of course, voting. Many of us know Paul for his leadership in making it possible for people finding themselves in hospitals on election day to vote. The law may have made it possible, but Paul and his cohorts made it feasible. Matthew Taylor contributes his efforts to community engagement, peer support, and membership events at Transitional Paths to Independent Living, a membership-based center for independent living in Washington County, operated by the local community of people with disabilities. Matt's passion is advocacy, and today he will inform us about accessibility of polling places. I'd like to point out the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh is signing people up to inspect their polling place for accessibility. Primarily, the League is looking at the need for ramps and elevators and whether the polling place has adequate signage. We recognize that the list of needs for accessibility is much longer than that, but this is the first time we're doing such a project, so we're taking measured steps. Anyone who would like to participate should contact me. So, now let's hear from our panelists. Could I start with Christine?
Okay.
Thanks very much.
I'm speaking as a visually impaired person and therefore talking about the barriers for visually impaired people. I want to say that these things have changed throughout time. There was a time in the distant past when secrecy was not an issue for ballots. People were supposed to let everybody know how they voted. And they were held accountable, I guess, when they left the polling place and people wanted to beat each other up. But as time went on, we got to the secret ballot. As I was growing up, I expected that I would always need help voting in one way or another. And therefore, I would expect that the person who helped me would be a trustworthy person and reflect my opinions when I voted. The first election that I pretended to vote at was the 1956 presidential election, and the first election that I actually voted at that was a presidential election was the 1972 one. I started voting in 1969. So, the barriers for visually impaired people, there's an issue just even trying to have the material that's accessible to them. It's true we can look online, but many websites are not designed with the blind person in mind, so to speak. It's very difficult for someone who's visually impaired who can use a computer, sometimes to sort out the relevant stuff on that website as opposed to the cute pictures. The cute pictures may have some value for some people, but I want the meat, thank you very much. So those accessibility issues are there. Our current social structures cause people who are older and living alone to have issues with just being able to get things accomplished. And especially when they have vision loss, they may not be able to do things as easily as they once were able to. People believe that this will all be solved if we can just put it online and everybody can take care of all their business online, whether it's registering or whatever. But remember, there are a vast number of people who are not really computer literate. They may have gotten a computer so they could keep in touch with their grandkids and use Facebook so they can see the family pictures. But as their vision deteriorates as they get older, they don't get to the point where they can learn how to use screen enlargement or speech to help them use a computer. So it doesn't really solve their problems. And besides, their vision gets worse, their hearing gets worse, so neither of those things are necessarily appropriate for them. The lack of training for poll workers and lack of familiarization with the equipment for the visually impaired voter. Remember, we get to do this once every 6 months if we're good, and a whole lot less often if we only vote on the elections that we deem to be important. You forget how to use the equipment between elections. And since the poll workers don't pay attention to how the special ballot marking devices work, when you get into a jam, you find that you're going like, I'm not going to do this ever again. This is just so unnerving. It's so irritating. I've never had that problem, but but that's just because I'm snotty. So anyway, that issue of poll workers not knowing how to help the person, and truly, the Allegheny County voting manual does tell them a whole lot of stuff. I have those pages. I have them, with the old machine. I don't have the new one yet. It tells them that there are 2 sets of headphones, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff and how to do it. And don't you know, I can't tell you, at least a couple people a year, people say, I never used this before. I don't know how to do it. It's right there in your book on page, whatever number that is. I want to say 38 and 39, but I don't remember. The transportation issues are difficult. If you choose to go to vote, some people find the transportation issues difficult. I happen to be able to walk 2 blocks to my polling place. That's not the case for a lot of people. If they have to arrange public transportation, access, a party worker, a cab, an Uber, and their income is somewhat limited, and they don't actually even know about much of it because, remember, if they're visually impaired, they're not going to peruse the newspapers or the signage or anything else out there as easily. So that's a barrier. But if they decide to stay home and vote, the absentee ballot application is now online. I did that. I had to know my PAID number so that my DMV information could be matched against my information that I put on there. And I figured that out. I had a way to scan my ID card on my phone and read the number. But I can't use the ballot that comes to me. It's not accessible. So again, you're back to the old days where you had to have another person help you do that. Now, I thought we'd gotten away from that when we went to the fancy new voting machines in Allegheny County, the Ivotronic, that all they had to do is flip a Dewey thingy and it turned into a talking voting machine. But nevertheless, it was the same machine that other people used. Another interesting barrier is the difficulty in locating sample ballots. I don't want to go to Google, who sells my information, to find my sample ballot. I don't want to go to somebody's Facebook page to look for one. I'd rather go to the state of Pennsylvania, who supposedly wouldn't be selling my data, and look at a sample ballot and say, oh, that's who I can vote for. Now, I know that we used to see the print sample ballots come out, but again, I have to wait until someone's at my house to look at the print sample ballot for my area to see just what I have to vote for. And if they can find me my polling place by me putting my address in, et cetera, they should be able to pop up my sample ballot on the same spot. I don't think it would take much more coding. The accessibility of the voting equipment itself. We expected, once we started using the voting equipment that would talk to us, and we didn't know any better, we assumed that when we had the digital recorded whatever, the DRE equipment, that it was going to tell us what it actually recorded when we pushed that final vote button. And so in review mode, we were fine. I mean, that was all we could ask for. But now that our equipment prints our ballot after we select it, I would like to be able to verify that printed ballot just as the person who does a hand-marked ballot can look at their ballot. Now, I can do it in review mode before it's printed, but I don't know if the printer printed the right thing. Somebody could hack between one place and the other, and I have no way of knowing. With the ES&S equipment, it could check the barcodes for me, but barcodes aren't the same thing as text. We know that, so that's a barrier. I'm not giving people solutions at this point because I think the solution should come from the whole community. I think that not having visually impaired poll workers is an interesting barrier to voting. I'm sure that many people on the county level have never thought of seriously visually impaired poll workers. I'm sure there are a lot of people who just have to hold things out a little further or whatever. But if the electronic poll books would talk to me, I'd love to be a poll worker. Allegheny County, I don't think, is even getting into the electronic poll book world yet anyway. But if we had more visually impaired poll workers, the system would be forced to use universal design characteristics for the voting equipment, and it would all work a little bit better, just as we should have more people who have mobility impairments as poll workers. That would straighten out which polling places are accessible and which polling places are not very quickly. And that bathroom issue that Maria mentioned would certainly be sorted out because anyone who had to stay there all day would know for sure whether that polling place had accessible bathrooms or not. There's an attitude in the greater community that we have to think of as a barrier, and that attitude is if you have one disability, you probably have at least one more. And normally what people assume is if you have vision or hearing or mobility impairments, you might well have mental limitations, not mental health kinds of things, but cognitive limitations. And that's something that you just can't prove to people in any other way than to just to go about living your life and show them that you are indeed able to think for yourself. And there's, of course, the last barrier to voting is, again, that absentee ballot issue. Since there's no way for me to complete an absentee ballot independently or privately, and I can't verify it once it's been completed, that is a true barrier to my voting. As Maria pointed out earlier, the absentee ballot solution is not a solution for, it's not the primary solution that we should have. The absentee ballot solution is only an interim, or at best, at least a secondary solution. And those 10 barriers, I believe, are big barriers for people with vision loss. And I would be glad to work with anybody to try to sort those out and how to solve them.
Thank you so much, Christine. Christine, I promise you, when the county starts to consider electronic poll books, Vote Allegheny and the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh will be there to make sure that they have accessibility features. Okay, our next speaker will be Nick Sinagro from Pathview, talking about the universal voting booth.
Hi. Is this on? You guys hear me? Okay. Is that it? I think it's on. No, I don't think it's on. I don't think it's on. Yeah, I think it's on.
Oh, it's not on. Maybe it doesn't get battery active.
Yeah. You good? All right, there we go. So I'm Vic Sinagro. I am the Director of Technology at Pathview, and I have been doing some independent research on the universal voting booth. And the key word there is universal, which we've already heard a few times today. This voting booth was developed by a company in California called IDEO, and they, on their website, the videos and the documentation that they have stressed universal. And that's something that is obviously very important to all of us, but also in the hardware and software development field. We try to stress that universal design aspect. So I'm going to go through some of the features. I do want to point out that this is still sort of being piloted. It's not, it is currently voted on in several states, Pennsylvania being one of them. And, but it is not a perfect system yet, but I think they're trying to get it as close as possible. So the booth itself, when you look at it, it looks typical of any voting booth. However, when you look closer, you'll see that one of the edges are very rounded off, which might not seem like a big deal, but that makes it more welcoming to some people, and a little safer for other people that are on the sharp edges. The voting system, the main part, is a typical touch screen, similar to an iPad or something like that. Okay? So that's one option for making your selections. If you're unable to use the touch screen for any reason, they give you several options for other ways of making your selection. First option, if you have some sort of any sort of low vision visual impairment, they provide you with headphones with, I believe it's up to 13 languages at this point, where they will walk you step by step through making your selection using a oversized tactile controller. The controller does have braille on it, and the headphones will tell you very specifically, step by step, what to do and which buttons to push, and so on. They also advertise that the controller may be useful for some people that have physical disabilities as well. Again, the edges are rounded off so that there's no risk of stabbing yourself or anything like that that I think we're all familiar with. The second option is switch input. Switch, as many of us with power wheelchairs know, we all have switches on our chair that can do multiple different things. So in this case, you could plug in any of your switches to the voting booth, and then it allows you to control by switch access, similar to switch access on your phone or on your computer. They also advertise that this could be useful for people with cognitive disabilities. Many people with cognitive disabilities prefer switch access when using technology. It simply is easier to focus on that switch. Now, the third option, which is personally my favorite, because I've been saying this for years, is that they allow you to pre-select who you're voting for on your cell phone. You can do this at home, at the polling place, wherever. Pre-select it on your phone. You get to the booth. The booth scans the code on your phone, and it puts your selections up on the screen. If you have a visual impairment, again with the headphones, it'll read back your selections. They make you confirm who you pre-selected on your phone, and then you confirm it, and those are your selections. Now, again, to me, that was a very exciting feature. I feel like most of us are probably able to use a cell phone of some sort. I think Google and Apple have done a great job of including many accessibility features. So using this app to do the pre-selection was very exciting to me. Again, the screen looks like a typical iPad screen. It's very bright, and they do that on purpose to make it easy to see and easy to verify. However, even with the brightness, it is private. If you're off to the side, if your assistant or your family members off to the side, they will not be able to see it. The polarized screen makes that impossible. So even though it's bright, it's also very private. The booth has an integrated ballot box. So after you confirm your selections, it goes directly into the ballot box. So again, is this system, is this technology perfect? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I'm sure that there are flaws. I'm sure that there are things that will come up as an issue, whether it's a privacy issue, whether it's a usability issue, an interface issue, and all that. But I think for the research that I have done, it seems like a good first step in really getting a universal booth that all of us can use, no matter what our ability or disability may be.
Thank you, Nick. And with regard to a perfect voting system, I can tell you there are so many conflicting goals in these things that you can never have a perfect voting system. Just as an example, and on the one hand, we have the goal of voter verifiability. You should leave the voting booth with confidence that your vote was recorded as you intended it to be. On the other hand, we also have the goal of ballot secrecy. So that's going to limit greatly the number of ways in which we can provide verifiability. For example, many people want to be able to take a receipt away from the polling booth that shows how they voted. And that actually can't be allowed, because if you could prove how you voted to another person, that would encourage bribery and coercion. Right? If you could prove it, someone could make you prove it. And that would not be a good thing. So thank you so much, Nick, for your research on that. And again, everyone, you can see the Universal Voting Booth at the Carnegie Museum of Art. Next, I'd like to have Paul O'Hanlon speak, please.
Well, I guess that the thing that most seems like a barrier to me is the whole registration issue. And that, and I think that we need to think more like Willie Sutton. Where's the money being held? And so, you know, I talked about personal care home. If you add nursing homes and personal care homes together and add up the number of people living there today in Pennsylvania, it represents the third largest city in the state. We have more people living in nursing homes and personal care homes than are living in Allentown, Pennsylvania. That's our third largest city. And the question is, whose job is it to register them to vote? And the answer is nobody's right now, because the state doesn't recognize nursing homes and personal care homes as being state-funded agencies that primarily serve people with disabilities. Now, if you go into a nursing home or a personal care home, everybody's going to look pretty much disabled. And so the question is, well, why aren't they? And the answer is, there's a whole lot of lack of clarity about this whole issue of whose job is it to register people with disabilities to vote. So there's around 2 million people with disabilities in Pennsylvania, and there's one entity given the job of registering them to vote, and that's state-funded disability service organizations. And if they don't do that, it ain't happening. And so, we really need to look beyond sort of the individual approach to voting and voting engagement and look at what's going to get our community engaged. And absent, I think one of the things I saw with working with Rachel is we really need community organizers. If we don't have community organizers making it happen, do you really expect the dominant culture to make sure that people with disabilities are registered to vote? I don't expect to. One of the things that I think was really interesting, the whole issue of, are you going to have a bad experience voting? So, for example, we know that, if you own a business or any kind of a thing that you're trying to get the public to engage in, the last thing you want to have happen is for them to have a bad experience, because they're not going to do it again. And yet, I would predict that the majority of people with disabilities would tell you a whole set of bad experiences they've had trying to vote. And so I don't think that we can minimize the impact of bad experiences. And I think that's one of the reasons why we need to get much better at that. But I think that the other question is, what is it that a minority group really is going to do to get, sort of get their proper place in a democracy? And I think that we really need to focus on getting everybody registered to vote, knowing that getting people registered to vote is the single greatest thing that you can do to get them to vote. There's no other thing that reaches the same impact on getting people to actually vote than getting them registered. And so there ain't nobody getting people registered to vote in nursing homes and personal care homes. There just isn't, and we really need to attend to that and start to think more like Willie Sutton. You know, where are the people with disabilities? Whose job is it to register them to vote? And if they're not doing that, we really need to confront that problem, because if it ain't happening, we're sort of not going to become a political factor in the democracy, because we won't have the votes.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, Matthew Taylor is going to talk about the accessibility of polling places, and I noted that the county is claiming this year that all 1,322 of our polling places are accessible. So I'm very curious to hear your opinion of that matter.
Allegheny County?
That's correct.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's right, you work mostly in Washington
We
County.
did our polling in Washington, Green, and Fayette. I would like to know the results of that also myself, though. I would first like to start with, to just work off what Paul was saying about the personal care homes, nursing homes. We have a nursing home transition program at Transitional Best Independent Living. We believe everyone should live in the community and have the same accessibility that everybody else has. So what we've noticed when going into nursing homes transitioning people, their records are not kept up to date. I believe this was mentioned. They do not have up-to-date driver's license or photo IDs. Their birth certificates get lost, paperwork gets lost. That makes transitioning hard. That also makes registering someone to vote hard. But I'm sorry, I'm not scrolling Facebook. I keep my notes on my phone. And it likes to lock up on me. My notes. So also, we in Washington Green and Fayette County, as I mentioned, we polled over 40 polling places in our SIL. I myself did around 15 polling places, and I would like to just share a couple of the stories. The one of the polling places we went to, the ramp was 1 to 8 inches, which ADA is 1 to 12, but when you got to the top of that ramp, it led to a step. So either way, that ramp was kind of useless. And when my colleague and I were measuring the ramp and noticing the step, someone frantically was running across the street to talk to us. And it happened to be the judge of elections. And she says, can I ask what you're doing? And we said, oh, we're just checking up the accessibility of the polling place, and we noticed it is inaccessible. And she begged us not to take her polling place because it is so convenient. And my response is, it's convenient for you because it's across the street and you can access it. And her response to that was, we have no people with disabilities in this community